That's not mine. Have you ever heard a sentence so cruel that the whole room seems to lose oxygen? I have, and I heard it from my husband. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates in front of both our families, in front of a catered table full of half-finished wine glasses and melting butter candles, in front of my mother, in front of his sister, in front of people who had smiled at my baby 10 minutes earlier and called him a blessing. Then Corvin lifted one finger and pointed straight at the stroller beside me. At that child, he said, louder this time, making sure every person in the room could hear him. That baby is not mine. The room went dead silent. Not quiet. Silent. The kind of silence that has weight to it. My mother, Liesel, I made this broken little sound in the back of her throat. Corvin's sister, Malin, stared at me so hard I could almost feel her searching my face for a confession. At the far end of the dining room, his attorney, Darian Voss, pushed his chair back so abruptly that the legs scraped against the floor. That sound snapped through the silence like a match strike. And me? I didn't cry. I didn't gasp. I didn't rush to defend myself, which is exactly what everyone expected me to do. Maybe that was the first thing that made them uneasy, because I'm Erwin Halbrook, 58 years old, and I have never in my life been known for swallowing an insult quietly, not from strangers, not from family, and certainly not from the man I had been married to for 32 years. But that night, I just looked at him, really looked at him, at the anger in his jaw, at the shine of sweat beginning near his temple, at the way his eyes kept flicking, not to me, not even to the baby, but to my handbag resting against the chair. That was when I knew. He wasn't afraid of what I might say. He was afraid of what I had brought. So I nodded once and said very softly, "Okay." You could feel the confusion spread through the room. Then, without hurrying, I reached into my bag and wrapped my fingers around a thick cream envelope I had carried with me all evening. The moment I pulled it out, Corvin froze, actually froze, and Darian stood up so fast his chair toppled backward. "Wait," he said sharply. "Don't open that. Now let me ask you something. What kind of man publicly denies his own child, then panics over one sealed envelope?" I looked from my husband to his lawyer, and for the first time that night, I smiled, because the lie he had just told was only the beginning. He chose the wrong audience. That thought settled in my mind the moment I saw who was sitting at that table. Let me take you back a few hours, before the accusation, before the silence, before that single sentence turned the night inside out, because none of this was spontaneous. Corvin planned this dinner. He called it a family announcement, said it was time to bring everyone together again. Both sides, no exceptions. People we hadn't spoken to in years suddenly received invitations. Even distant cousins showed up, curious, cautious. And then there was one guest who didn't belong at a family dinner, Darian Voss, his lawyer. I remember pausing when I saw him walk in, adjusting his cufflinks like he'd stepped into the wrong room. Legal matters never rest, Corvin had said, lightly when I asked. But that wasn't true. Legal matters don't attend dinner unless they're meant to witness something. And I knew that because for months Corvin had been changing, not in obvious ways, nothing dramatic. That would have been easier to confront. No, his shift was careful, quiet. He started taking calls outside, always lowering his voice when I entered the room. Documents began disappearing from his desk the moment I got near them. Accounts we had shared for decades suddenly became complicated, filled with new terms, new structures, new justifications. When I asked, he smiled. When I pressed, he deflected. And then came the comments. "You've been forgetful lately, Erwin. At our age, these things, they happen. You're under a lot of stress. It affects judgment. Tell me, what does that sound like to you? Concern or groundwork? Because to me it sounded like someone slowly building a story, and then there was the pregnancy. At 57, I knew exactly how it would look. I knew the whispers would come. That's why I kept the IVF process quiet, contained, clinical, documented. There was only one person who signed beside me, Corvin. He was there. He knew. But somewhere between that clinic visit and the night I gave birth to Eisen, something shifted in him. He began speaking, differently. Not to me, to others. I could see it in the way his sister avoided direct questions, in how his family's smiles became strained, curious, skeptical. They weren't reacting to the truth. They were reacting to something he had already told them. A version of events that painted me as unreliable, confused, maybe even deceitful, and I let it happen. I didn't correct them, I didn't argue, because while he was planting doubt, I was collecting certainty. Every document, every signature, every transaction he thought I didn't notice, I built it slowly, carefully, and I waited. So when he stood there that night and pointed at my child, our child, and said, "That's not mine," I wasn't shocked. I was disappointed, because he moved too soon. And now? Now we were going to do this in front of everyone. I glanced down at the envelope in my hand, then back at him. He thought this moment belonged to him, but what he didn't understand yet was that the envelope didn't just answer his accusation, it explained why he made it. And that truth was far worse. The envelope was never meant to defend me. It was meant to expose him. I didn't open it, not yet. Instead, I placed it gently on the table between us, right in front of Corvin. The movement was slow on purpose, controlled, deliberate, the kind that makes people lean in without realizing it. "Go on," I said, my voice even. "Tell them everything. Now let me ask you something. What does a man do when he thinks he still has control of the story?" He talks. Corvin straightened slightly, as if I'd just handed him the stage back. "She got pregnant without fully involving me," he said, gesturing vaguely in my direction. "At her age. Under circumstances I wasn't comfortable with." Murmurs. Subtle, but spreading. I could feel eyes shifting again. Measured now. Uncertain, and good, because uncertainty cracks faster than certainty. "Without involving you," I repeated, tilting my head just enough to catch his eyes. He hesitated, just a fraction, but I saw it, and so did Darian. "Erwin," Darian cut in, his tone controlled but tight. "This isn't necessary." "Oh, it is," I said softly. Then I reached into my bag again, not for the envelope. Not yet. This time I pulled out a folded document, slightly worn at the edges from being handled more than once. I unfolded it carefully and laid it flat on the table. "Do you remember this, Corvin?" He didn't look down. That was his mistake, because everyone else did, and once they saw it, they couldn't unsee it. "A consent form," I said, tapping the paper lightly. "From the clinic." Now he looked, and I watched the exact moment recognition hit him. His signature sat there in clean, unmistakable ink, dated, witnessed, legally binding. You signed it, I continued, my tone almost conversational. You were present. You agreed. A ripple passed through the room, this time sharper, more focused. Corvin recovered quickly, but not cleanly. That doesn't prove anything. Documents can be forged. I finished for him. I let that word sit in the air. Then I reached into my bag again and slid out a second sheet. Verification. Official authentication. Time-stamped. Cross-referenced. Placed directly beside the first. No drama, just facts. Now even Darian had gone quiet, because this was no longer a family disagreement. This was evidence being introduced, layer by layer. You knew, I said, looking at Corvin steadily. From the beginning. His jaw tightened. His hands curled slightly against the table. And yet, I continued, you chose tonight, this room, to say otherwise. Why? That question didn't need to be spoken out loud. It was already there, hanging, heavy, because now the story didn't make sense anymore, not his version, not unless there was something else, something. I tapped the envelope lightly with one finger. That's where this comes in. Darian moved again, faster this time. Erwin, if you open that, you're escalating this into something you cannot walk back. I looked at him, then at Corvin, then back at the envelope. Into what? I asked. No one answered. And that silence told the truth before the documents ever could, because whatever was inside this envelope, it wasn't about whether the child was his. It was about why he needed everyone to believe the child wasn't. And I was done waiting. He stopped denying it. Did you catch that? Not the accusation, not the tension, the shift. Corvin wasn't arguing about the baby anymore. He was watching the envelope. That's when you know the truth has already changed sides. His eyes kept returning to it. Quick, involuntary glances, like it might open on its own if he didn't keep track of it. His shoulders had gone rigid, his confidence thinning into something tighter, sharper. Fear doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like control slipping, one breath at a time. You've built quite a story, he said finally, his voice edged, but quieter now. But you're still guessing. Am I? I asked. I didn't move the envelope yet. Instead, I rested my hand on it, flat, steady, unclaiming it without revealing it, and then I gave them something else. 3 months ago, I said, I received a call. That pulled the room in closer than any raised voice could have, because a call means interruption, a disruption of plans, not from family, I continued, not from the clinic. I let a small pause stretch. From a bank. That's when Darian went still, completely still. If you were in that room, you would have missed it unless you were watching carefully. But I was. Corvin, on the other hand, reacted too quickly. That's irrelevant. He snapped. Too fast, too defensive. That depends, I said, my voice calm, on what you were moving. Now the air changed. This wasn't about relationships anymore. It was about money, structure, intent, the things people hide behind paperwork and timing. The call was routine at first, I went on. A flagged transaction, large, unusual only because of where it came from. I looked directly at him. Our joint holdings. A few people shifted in their seats. Someone whispered, and where it went, I added, was even more interesting. I let that sit, because suspense isn't about speed. It's about pressure. A newly established account, I said. Layered, redirected, quiet. Darian closed his eyes for a brief second, just one, but it was enough, because now he understood something he hadn't before. He wasn't managing this situation. He'd been brought into it, and Corvin, he was unraveling. You're twisting routine financial planning into... No, I cut in, not raising my voice, just sharpening it. I'm aligning timing. That's when I leaned slightly forward. When did the transfer happen, Corvin? He didn't answer, so I did. The same week, Eisen's legal documentation was filed. Now the room reacted, not loudly, but visibly, because even without legal knowledge, people understand patterns. Coincidence only stretches so far before it snaps. And that's when it became clear, I said, my tone lowering, drawing them in. Why you needed distance. Why he needed doubt, because if the child wasn't his, then the child had no claim, no inheritance, no disruption to whatever he had already started moving out of reach. This wasn't confusion, it wasn't fear, it was planning, cold, precise, and patient. Corvin stepped forward suddenly, anger cracking through the pressure. You're making assumptions you can't prove. That was his last defense. Assumption. I looked down at the envelope, then back at him. No, I said quietly, I'm done assuming. And finally, I lifted it. Darian's voice came again, lower now, almost resigned. Erwin, if you open that, this becomes official. I met his gaze. It already is. My thumb slid under the seal, and for the first time that night, Corvin didn't argue. He didn't interrupt. He didn't deny. He just watched, because he knew, the moment that envelope opened, this stopped being his story, and became the truth. The envelope opened with a soft, almost insignificant sound, but in that silence it might as well have been thunder. I didn't rush. That's important, because moments like this, they don't land because of speed. They land because of certainty. I reached inside and pulled out the first document, smoothing it carefully against the table. A full financial audit, I said. No dramatics, no raised voice, just fact. It traces every transfer made from our joint accounts over the past 12 months. Now here's the part no one in that room expected. I didn't look at Corvin when I said it. I looked at everyone else, because this was no longer between him and me. It shows layered movements, I continued. Accounts opened under shell structures, funds redirected in increments designed to avoid attention. I tapped one section lightly, until they didn't. Darian stepped closer now, reading, not as a lawyer controlling a situation, but as a man realizing he had walked into something uncontained. The second document came next. I placed it beside the first. A drafted amendment, I said. To your will, I, Corvin. Now I looked at him. Unsigned but prepared. His face had lost all colour, and very specific. I read it aloud. Any child born after the date of issue shall require verified paternity prior to inclusion as a beneficiary. A loophole, clean, legal, intentional, built not in reaction but in anticipation. Then came the third, the one that ended any version of denial. I set a small device on the table and pressed play. His voice filled the room, clear, controlled, unmistakable. If I establish doubt early, it complicates her claim. By the time it's resolved, the assets will already be protected. No one moved, no one spoke, because now every question had an answer. Logical, complete, irrefutable. He knew the child was his. He planned around it. He engineered doubt, not out of emotion, but strategy. And tonight was meant to be the first public fracture, but it failed. Slowly I turned the device off, and for the first time all evening I let myself feel something. Not anger, not even betrayal, just clarity. You weren't confused, I said to him quietly. You were careful. Across the table my mother began to cry softly. Maylin stepped back, putting physical distance between herself and her brother. One of the cousins muttered something under their breath. Something about disgusting. Something about planned. And Darian, he straightened, his voice firm now, but no longer protective. You withheld material information, he said to Corvin. You involved me in a setting that now has multiple witnesses to potential financial misconduct. Legal consequences. Immediate. Real. This opens exposure, he continued, not just civil, possibly criminal. That's when it hit Corvin, not when I spoke, not when the documents appeared, but when his own structure turned against him. He tried to respond, but there was nothing left to stand on, because truth doesn't argue, it settles. I gathered the documents slowly, leaving copies on the table, deliberately, because this wasn't something that could be taken back. Then I reached for the stroller. Eason stirred slightly, his small hand shifting under the blanket before settling again, unaware of the architecture of lies that had just collapsed around him. I turned toward the door, not in a hurry, not escaping, just finished. Halfway there, I paused, not for Corvin, for the room. For anyone still wondering, I said calmly, meeting their eyes one by one. He is his father. A breath. And now that's the least important part, because what mattered had already been decided. Within days the consequences unfolded exactly as they had to. Darian formally withdrew and filed notice of conflict. An independent investigation began into the financial transfers. Accounts were frozen pending review. Corvin's reputation, carefully built over decades, began to fracture under scrutiny that no longer came from whispers, but from records. Socially, the shift was just as immediate. His family didn't defend him. They distanced. Calls stopped. Invitations disappeared. And me, I didn't fight for any of it. I didn't need to. Legally, the documentation secured Eisen's position without dispute. The very systems Corvin tried to manipulate became the ones that preserved everything he tried to hide. Weeks later, in a quieter room, with no audience and no performance, I signed the final papers that separated my life from his. No spectacle, no confrontation, just ink, clean, final, and on a calm afternoon, sitting by the window with Eisen asleep against my chest, I realized something simple. He had spent months trying to erase us. All I had done was let him reveal himself. And that was enough.